Talk of retailers battling out to capture a new market in Africa. Just how vibrant do you think the opportunities for retailers are?
I think they're good and great opportunities in Africa. One must remember there's a lot of retail trade that happens in Africa, most of it informal. So what one would think that what a retailer would do is try to formalize this trade that exists. Therefore, I think the opportunities are great because we don't have large shops and large networks of retail outlets in this continent.
All right. I mean, we're told that the retailers are capitalizing on the so-called burgeoning African middle class. Collectively, across 53 African countries, we're looking at about 300 million people to tap into. The challenge, though, is that they're all spread across this vast geography that is Africa. How do you capture the market?
A good question. We did a study across a dozen African countries about the middle class, and we found that they have quite a bit of expenditure at their disposal. The challenge, as you've stated there, is they are not large enough in each individual countries. For example, Ethiopia, in Rwanda, in Uganda, in Tanzania, and so forth. So I think the strategy would be a pan-African retail outlet chain, as opposed to having them in single countries.
One of the biggest problems facing Africa is that despite the vast tracts of land, despite the fact that we are huge agricultural economies in general, it's been said that Africa is not a net exporter of food, it tends to be a net importer of food because of structural problems in our economies. And this raises issues around supplier chains and how stable they are in Africa for any retailer entering new frontiers.
Yes, there's a huge problem with supply chains, and it's because of the inefficiencies in this continent and the hardships that one goes bringing goods from one place to another. We need to develop our infrastructure, of course. We need to develop the quality of our built environments. We need to improve the quality of the value addition chain across the supply chain, so that we have opportunities across the value chain, so that retailers can actually get goods that are well priced, that are affordable to the markets.
Synergies also, Dr. Murungi, in terms of, the retailer may exist in a large economy like South Africa, but there's a need to set up shop when you get into Africa. So regulatory issues, infrastructure issues that you're talking about, but also some sort of collaboration between property developers and the retailers as well, because it's one thing to capture the market, but you've also got to provide the facilities to do so. Is that a problem?
I don't think it's a problem, and I think it's the correct way to go, because when one looks at the built environment in many African cities, they're really of low quality, and offering a good retail experience for shoppers is really what a retailer wants to do. So this collaboration, where you get into discussions with architects and physical planners and builders and sort of design your shops as the development takes place, I think it's a good way to go, and I think we'll have much better quality retail environments if that is what happens in this market.
Now, the news has been dominated by the proposed acquisition between Walmart and Massmart, a deal valued at about 32 billion South African rands. The fear is that it's going to create a retail giant of note with exclusive supply arrangements that stretch as far as Asia, and effectively is going to squeeze out some of the smaller operators in Africa. Is there concern about Walmart possibly entering Africa through Massmart?
I think there's a great concern. As you said earlier, the economies are quite small. The middle classes in numbers are not quite large. And therefore, when a shop sets up like that, a retail chain with such power, it is going to sort of put a lot of businesses out of practice. We have small retailers that are thriving. In East Africa, we have sort of a dozen shops and outlets that are branded, and they're doing a good job. I think they'll be out of business if you have such huge players coming in. I don't know about South Africa. Probably South Africa can take such a big retailer, but I don't think the other parts of the continent can.
All right, on another note, we're also getting reports about a prominent Kenyan retailer, Nakumatt, expanding its branch network into EAC member states like Uganda, for instance. Talk to us about the rivalry and the competition that exists in that market.
Yes, you must recall Nakumatt was a shop that came in much later. I think the oldest chain in this part of the continent was Uchumi, and we had Ibrahim's. It has a very good strategy in terms of the quality of its retail environments, the quality of its shops, and I think the way it's expanded has been very slowly. It's made decisions as it goes. It's not had this a fast expansion, and it's really improving the shopping experience, and its strategy has also has linked up with what you said earlier with developers in shopping malls across the continent.
Okay, let's bring in our guest host, Vikas Murray. The biggest challenge we're facing in an economy like South Africa is that retail sales figures are not recovering significantly enough. The consumer is still holding back after a recession that we've spoken about at length. In an environment where consumers are holding back, despite the fact that there's a fledgling middle class in Africa, are there indications that the African consumer is ready to spend? Is this a time to be doing retail?
There's definitely a difference between what's happening in South Africa and what's happening in the rest of Africa. In the rest of Africa, which is very much commodity driven, the high dollar prices for commodities are allowing some money to flow through to these emerging middle classes, and there's definitely money to be made. So what you actually see is that in South Africa, because of the overextension of credit in the previous upswing, consumers are not ready to spend. So South African retailers are looking at the rest of Africa to expand. So a very large part of the expansion of the South African retailers is the African thing. And the perception certainly is that Shoprite is the one that's getting it right. And that's also why the Shoprite share price has been so strong.
You talk about Shoprite, and they've also announced a plan to raise an additional 2 billion rands for further expansion. They've got 288 stores in 14 countries. Should they be thinking about consolidation, or should they be thinking about organic growth beyond these 14 countries?
They're certainly looking for more growth. They believe that there's a space which they know how to capture, which their experience up to now has given them an edge in that market. So they are keen to expand, which is why they're raising money to do so. One of the issues that's arising now is that they are obviously, one of the challenges going into these markets is to have supply chains of the right kind of products, and if your competitors can just come in after you and utilize the supply chains that you have spent years to build, that's sometimes a bit frustrating. So we see the Zambian thing is probably about that very issue.
Hotspots, Vikas, were told for real returns in retail: Nigeria, Egypt and Morocco. We're not actually talking about the rest of Africa then?
Well, those three would be very much the oil-driven economies, except for Egypt, which obviously has got slightly different issues. But those are the large markets that are untapped, and those are also the places that's got big infrastructure programs. Now, remember, we were talking about infrastructure being one of the things that holds retail back. So if the infrastructure goes out, that means the retailers can follow.
Okay, Dr. Murungi, a final question to you. We're seeing, for instance, innovations in ICT, banks working with mobile operators for easier transactions. That could also create a situation where retailers could go into rural areas, because at the moment they seem to be clamoring for access to the middle class in urban Africa. What about those on the peripheries?
Yes, you're right. In fact, there's a licensing change which allows retail traders to act on behalf of other service providers like banks and so forth, which means that the offering at retail trade in the rural areas now can encompass other things other than goods and packaged products, which means that there are other opportunities out there to be grabbed by retailers that are looking at serving mass markets and serving across several product categories as well.